has been thrust upon Milady in these drawn-out proceedings. So, Milady, we essentially relied on two experts. One was Mr. Hopper, who opining on the employer-employee relationship in relation to ideas which came about within the course and scope of his employment with his employer. But that's not correct, Milady. Mr. Hopper understood the context in which Mr. McCarthy was seeking to market his ideas. And if one could look at Mr. Hopper's report, which you find at CL 10-25, 010-25.
10. Just give me that CL again.
It's 010-25.
Yes.
And does Milady have it?
Yes, I have it.
And Milady, you'll see that at 010-27, Mr. Hopper says in 1.2, according to my understanding, Mr. McCarthy is not seeking remuneration for extra effort or performance, but rather a direct monetary participation in his innovation. Such direct participation corresponds to participation in the exploitation of the property right, i.e. the monopoly right that Mr. McCarthy brought to Vodacom. In fact, Mr. McCarthy did not bring such a monopoly right to Vodacom, therefore his remuneration approach lacks a proper economic basis. Now, Mr. Puckren, or perhaps can't recall if it was Mr. Marcus, but they used the phrase that he would get not a cent, not nothing, and that's what was worth it. It was in that context, and it's really taken out of context, that criticism arose. What Mr. Hopper was saying is that if you have come up as an employee with a clever idea outside of the work environment, and you bring it to your employer, you should be able to give him some kind of participation in the exploitation of that right. Now, in this instance, Mr. McCarthy could not do so for a variety of reasons, and we'll demonstrate a bit later on, Milady, that the difficulty with Mrs. idea and the PCM product was that MTN was in the process of developing its own product and had applied for a patent relating to a similar idea. The methodology didn't really matter. It was the idea of being able to prompt a return call in these circumstances. And MTN was in the process of patenting that process. So one refers to the inability of Mr. McCarthy to give any type of participation in a property right to Vodacom, not to denigrate his idea, but just to contextualize it. And Mr. Hopper goes on to really examine how best to compensate Mr. McCarthy. And in that regard, he looked at one of the methodologies of valuing an employee's remuneration for their innovation, and that is if it at least gives some extra performance in the sense that Mr. McCarthy had done, and which he was lauded for in the Talk Time magazine, which our learned friends have spoken about. And that also, milady, again contextualizes the employer-employee relationship. The fact that he was lauded as an employee of Vodacom and it was described by Mr. Mthembu in that same article as, can you imagine what growth this company would experience if more employees like Mr. McCarthy would come forward with ideas that were conceived outside of the work environment and bring them to Vodacom. And for our learned friends to refer to the amendment to our plea, where initially it had been pleaded that the fruits of Mr. McCarthy's labor belonged to his employer, Vodacom, was based on the misconception that he had produced that idea. Vodacom should not be criticized for having appreciated its error, but that does not then mean that Vodacom was precluded forever and a day, relying upon the milieu in which Mr. McCarthy had placed himself as an employee of Vodacom, and that therefore Mr. Hopper's guidance was appropriate and not inappropriate, as the learned friend Mr. Puckman seeks to suggest. Then, milady, the only basis for remuneration for this idea, according to Mr. Hopper, in his report, you find that at 101-34, would have been on the basis of the 3 or 4 months lead time that he would have given to Vodacom ahead of MTN, which was in the process of developing its own similar product. So, Mr. Hopper, and that, milady, you find at page 27, 1010-27, Mr. Hopper said the only real basis to arrive at a figure to compensate Mr. McCarthy would be on the basis of an employee's extraordinary ideas or extra performance, which adds value to the company. And it was in that context that inter alia, he had suggested a maximum figure based on his research of 500,000 euros at the time, which would have given one about 7.5 million rand. Vodacom also looked at its own performance reward or incentive programs as a way to compensate Mr. McCarthy. And I don't want to belabor any of that. Milady knows that there were various methodologies applied. What was ultimately fixed upon was what the highest paid employee of Vodacom, who obviously had come up with his own presumably good ideas during the term of his office, and what he would have earned, and inflation was taken into account, and a figure of 7.7 to 8.3 million rand was proposed, and that, milady, you find at, I'll just give milady the reference, 039-27. And Vodacom then rounded off that amount to propose 10 million rand as reasonable compensation. Vodacom also, during the submission process before the CEO, utilized the assistance and elicited this assistance of Dr. George Hoopus, a director of Frontier Economics. His curriculum vitae is in the papers, milady. I could just give milady the reference. It's CL 039-27. And he looked at various proposals and amounts, and he again observed that Vodacom would have had no first mover advantage in the product because MTN had launched a similar service. That you find, milady, I'll just give you the reference. It's CL 010-37. And at 38, he thought that the figure proposed by Vodacom of between 7.7 million and 8.3 was not unreasonable, and if anything was likely to be on the high side. Vodacom also went outside and looked at large companies such as FNB, Discovery, Nedbank, even their competitor MTN, how they rewarded employees in arriving at their figure of 10 million rand. So, milady, we really submit that even if generous assumptions are made in Mr. McCarthy's favor to treat him as a CEO instead of a senior engineer or an exceptionally innovative employee, the amount of 47 million far exceeds international and domestic standards for the remuneration of employees in innovations and massively exceeds the combined remuneration and compensation given by Vodacom to its top innovators. And, milady, Vodacom went outside of the first two Frontier reports that were utilized during the proceedings before the CEO and approached Frontier to arrive at, if there was, a figure in the hypothetical marketplace of ideas. And they did so, and milady sees they did a third and fourth report, and milady would find the third Frontier report at 051-1. And just reading through that report, one would see, milady, that the first difficulty that one had in assessing the value of Mr. McCarthy's idea was that there were no direct revenues or profits associated with the PCM product. Because milady will know it was never charged for and was offered as a free service. And I'm going to, in dealing with the fourth criticism, the CEO's models and determination, highlight the difficulties that the CEO had, and also how it would now appear Mr. McCarthy accepts that the path of looking at revenue that could have been generated by this product is quite a slippery slope and a very difficult concept to quantify or even really get a full understanding of. But Dr. Hoopus goes on to say that if a revenue share approach was to be used, he accepted that the forward-looking model used by Mr. Yusuf was the preferred method. That milady finds in paragraph 141 of his report. Other than the length and level of revenue share, the assumptions used by the CEO he felt were reasonable. And he then looked at a lump sum that would have been payable to Mr. McCarthy. And really said it would have been between a range of 5.7 million to 21.1 million, and that milady finds at 051-38 paragraph 142. And he then also examined the sum of 47 million in the context of the hypothetical marketplace for ideas, and said here the range would have been between 17 million and 25 million at a maximum. And milady, that's to be found paragraph 143 at 051-39. So when one looks at these figures and the analysis that was done by Mr. Hopper, the Vodacom itself, in relation to other companies, and by Dr. Hupis on behalf of Frontier, we submit, milady, that the 47 million rand figure is exceedingly generous and could not be considered to have led to a patently inequitable result. And Mr. McCarthy has not really made out any case for why that figure is not eminently reasonable and has not led to a patently inequitable result. It's noteworthy, milady, that even as we sit here, there is no figure that Mr. McCarthy has put forward. We don't know what his figure is. It's never been quantified by him. We've had estimates of 20 million, 40 million. We look at the proposal, and I'll deal with what my learned friend Mr. Machau dealt with in his submissions. But even that, one has to extrapolate and try and analyze what the number is. So milady, we submit that having regard to all the factors that Vodacom submits, milady should take into account, the amount that was awarded to him was eminently fair. I just want to also pick up from what my learned friend Mr. Trengrove had argued relating to the service provider model. And milady, both Mr. Hopper, but in particular Dr. Hupis, analyzed why Mr. McCarthy could not be considered in the same category as an ordinary service provider. There are numerous reasons why that wouldn't be the correct approach. The fact that he simply came up with the idea, he didn't have the methodology. It was Vodacom's engineers that developed the notion of the USSD platform. Just to tell milady, I think it's common cause on the papers that platform is used to service the network. So it's not the same platform over which SMSs go. So that was quite innovative on the part of Vodacom's engineers, and I can tell milady it's also common cause on the papers that MTN ultimately copied Vodacom and also used the USSD platform for their idea. And that demonstrates how at that time the duopoly consisting of MTN and Vodacom operated. They would monitor each other products very carefully and would imitate its products very carefully. And that's what both Mr. Hopper and Dr. Hupis say about the really lead time advantage of only 3 to 4 months. So he didn't have the technical solution. That was the Vodacom's technical team that developed it. He couldn't be a service provider because he chose to remain an insider. He didn't provide any service to Vodacom. least of all, we submit in a manner which would have entitled him to a fixed profit share under an indefinite term contract. He also did not make any financial contribution at all. His brilliant idea triggered the process, but it was, we would submit, and that is reinforced by the experts we relied upon. It was a small component of the technical challenges, investment and development it took to realize the final product. And in contrast to a service provider who comes with a complete solution to Vodacom, it has the idea and the technical solution. Mr. McCarthy didn't take any credit risk. Unlike service providers, he didn't provide the billing, customer support, sign up. He didn't build any distribution channel. They do all their own marketing. So all of these factors, milady, we submit really distinguishes Mr. McCarthy from a service provider, a WASP, or a value-added service, a VAS provider. Milady, Dr. Hoopus also reinforced the notion that it would be unusual to have any type of ongoing revenue share arrangement in these type of circumstances, and would really amount to financial suicide for a company to engage in that type of arrangement as Mr. McCarthy suggests. Milady, if I could then move on to the next category, which is Mr. Yusuf's process we submit was exceedingly fair. We do not believe there to be a dispute that the process was fair. We would invite Milady to find that the process that he followed, and Milady's heard from a learned friend, Mr. Trengrove, that as a valuer, he wasn't obliged to follow so elaborate a process of engagement with the party. But it demonstrated utmost good faith by allowing and granting the parties the widest latitude in making their submissions. And the entire process was undertaken fairly and in good faith. And we don't understand our learned friends to cavil against that submission. They now say he sullied his hands by entering into the arena. We submit that's not the case at all. I'm not going to repeat submissions that have been made by others in that regard, save to state, Milady, that there can be no doubt that the process was fair, and we refer, Milady, to 085-15.
Sorry, what's that number?
085-15.
Oh. -15. Yes.
Paragraph, no, I think it should be 2 pages back.
Yes, I'm there.
Paragraph 14.1, where he says, I do not dispute the manner in which the CEO conducted himself, and the process which he followed was one of apparent fairness. And that is the replying affidavit of Mr. McCarthy to the second respondent, answering explanatory affidavit. Oh no, our answering affidavit. Milady can thus comfortably find that the process followed was fair in all respects, Before this court, Mr. McCarthy argues that the CEO had to confine himself to a single model of analysis. And really, Mr. McCarthy, as he would have it, is that Mr. Yusuf was confined to Mr. McCarthy's model and no other, and to the extent that he so much as considered other alternatives, that, in a sense, led to some innate unfairness towards Mr. McCarthy. But, milady, that cannot detract from our submission that the process was fair and that the CEO, in developing his own models, acted in an eminently fair manner towards Mr. McCarthy. We look at the CEO's methodology to demonstrate the fairness he had dropped. And milady would have known that he really looked at 4 models. That, milady, you see from his determination which starts at 004-1. First, he considered a revenue share model looking backwards. This was broadly in line with Mr. McCarthy's model, but the CEO then corrected certain of the assumptions in the model, which he considered to be accurate and appropriate, and you see that at 004-13, paragraph 6.6. Yes. Then he considered the employee reward model, which was Vodacom's preferred approach, and milady sees that at 004-13 to 004-14. Our learned friends criticized the CEO for even mentioning Vodacom's employer reward model, sort of say he was still clinging somehow to that notion and didn't want to let go of it. Milady, it would have been inappropriate for him not to have dealt with what Vodacom had submitted to him. That's all he was doing. And he was looking at Vodacom's model, which in the end he didn't. He rejected, and he, as he was entitled to. The CEO, the third model, he developed his own. The third model was the time window lock model, and here he sought to confine the investigation to the actual customers who initiated PCM requests. And this was a more limited approach, but he thought it conformed more accurately to the original ideas conceptualized by Mr. McCarthy, and milady finds that at 004-18. And that was a model that reflected customers who had run out of prepaid phone credit or airtime, and would have been more likely to receive a response to a PCM message that generated revenue for Vodacom. And then finally, he developed his own, this is the fourth model, his own 2001 forward-looking model on the basis that he had to place himself in the shoes of the CEO in 2001 and look forward in order to break the deadlock. And milady finds that at 004-17, para 10.7. He assessed the following amounts. He assessed 42.2 million rand for the first model, the revenue share model looking backwards. He assessed 21.8 million. Milady finds that at 004-17, 10.11. For the employee reward model, he adjusted Vodacom's model to present-day value and arrived at that figure. Then thirdly, the time window lock model, he arrived at a figure of 38.1 million. That, milady, sees it 004-18 to 19. And then finally, the 2001 forward-looking model arrived at a figure of 51.5 million. And what he then did is he took the two highest amounts, that's the first and fourth models, and arrived at a figure of 47, rounded it off and arrived at a figure of 47. Now, milady, we say it's important to note that the CEO made several generous assumptions in Mr. McCarthy's favor in determining these sums. One of them, our learned friends, Mr. Cooper, has already pointed out on the graph that we looked at. Milady, I'm not going to repeat that. He also found that although Vodacom had never paid for any ideas to any supplier, allowed for a 5% share of revenue. He considered the typical period for third-party service contracts to be between 3 and 5 years, but he nevertheless allowed for 5 years in generosity to Mr. McCarthy. He noted that Mr. McCarthy's counsel had accepted the correct approach was a forward-looking approach, but he nevertheless took a perspective looking backwards into account, which was again in Mr. McCarthy's favor. He also, milady, considered that interest would only accrue once the determination was made, but yet he adjusted for the time value of money, which is again very much in Mr. McCarthy's favor, so he was not prejudiced by the lapse of time. And might I mention, milady, it should not be left unchallenged that the period of time that is taken in this matter is a lot to do with Mr. McCarthy. He only instituted proceedings in these matters, I think, in 2008 or 2009, which led to the trial taking place in 2012, 2013, and a judgment in 2014. And then there were the negotiation, then there was the processes going through the courts till eventually he got the Constitutional Court judgment in his favor. And then the negotiations were also interrupted when Mr. McCarthy, as my learned friend Mr. Trengo, went to the Constitutional Court.
But we can't hold that against him, Mr. Solomon.
No, not at all.
David and Goliath.
No, well, milady, we felt a bit outgunned. I mean, I'm one of 4, and I see Mr. Prakran's one of 6. So I'm not sure who the Goliath is and who the David is, milady. But be that as it may, he also, in assessing the employee reward model, applied the highest bonus and was exceedingly generous there. And then he took the average of the two highest yielding models, which I made the point, but again, that was generous to him. So, milady, we must make the point, and it's in his determination, that he found it a difficult exercise. This was not an easy exercise, probably an exercise that only the CEO of Vodacom could have performed. And I know our learned friends say with hindsight, it wasn't a good idea to have had the CEO, but there was no one better qualified than the CEO of Vodacom to have performed this task. And once you accept